Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Kasia Tokarska, and I'm going to present the constraint findings regarding the new generation of climate models and how the observed warming trend allows us to provide constraint projections of future warming. The latest generation of climate models from the phase 6 of the coupled model intercomparison project CMIC6 will inform much of the physical science basis for the upcoming 6th assessment report of the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Many of the new models that study the climate system are now at higher spatial resolution, have a better representation of biogeochemical processes, both on land and in the ocean, and as they also have a better representation of some large-scale atmospheric patterns, such as El Niño oscillation and monsoon rainfall. Climate sensitivity is the ultimate warming of the climate system in response to doubling of the atmospheric CO2 concentration from the pre-industrial levels. It is a common metric for model benchmarking and intercomparison. Comparing CMIC6 models to the previous generation of models in CMIC5, the range of climate sensitivity values is wider, and several of the new CMIC6 climate models project stronger future warming and have higher climate sensitivity than the previous model generations. CMIC6 models also exceed the likely range of ECS reported by the IPCC 5th assessment report of 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. Also, a recent estimate of ECS from the World Climate Research Program, WCRP, based on multiple lines of evidence, concludes that ECS values above 4.5 degrees Celsius are very unlikely. Future global warming estimates have been similar across past assessments, but several of the CMIC6 models simulate much stronger warming than previously thought, apparently inconsistent with those past assessments. Looking at the simulated warming trend for the present-day period of 1981 to 2017, we can see that CMIC6 models span a wide range of warming. The gray rectangle shows the observed warming trend for that period based on two different observational datasets. Many of the CMIC6 models tend to overestimate the observed warming trend, and thus their future higher warming projections are less likely. Projected future warming is also correlated with the simulated warming trend period across the CMIC5 and CMIC6 models. This correlation between present and future warming allows us to provide observational constraints on future warming in CMIC6 models. Here is the projected warming in an ambitious mitigation scenario, the Shared Socioeconomic Pathway, or SSP 1 to 6, and the thick pink line shows the multi-model mean response with the 5 to 95% range of the model spread shown by the shaded area. If we now apply the observational constraint to the raw model responses shown in pink, we end up with the observationally constrained blue area. The constrained multimodal mean shown by the thick blue line is consistent with reaching the Paris Agreement target. Generally, observationally constrained CMIC6 warming is consistent with previous IPCC assessments based on CMIC5. Other studies confirm these findings, and overall there is little evidence for the stronger future warming projections by the high ECS models. To conclude, several new CMIC6 climate models project stronger future warming and have higher climate sensitivity values than previous model generations. We show that these models overestimate the observed warming trends, and as a result, their future warming projections are less likely. High warming models are still useful for different purposes, such as climate impacts and risk assessment. Most importantly, these results do not mean that climate change is not serious. but there is little evidence that warming will be stronger than what we thought.
A warm welcome, everyone, also from my side. My name is Carl-Friedrich Schleussner. I'm the head of climate science at Climate Analytics, a Berlin-based research and policy institute and partner in the CONSTRAIN project. And I want to talk about our understanding of the Paris Agreement long-term temperature goal. Close to the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, a lot has been said, unfortunately also done about it. However, there are still some important misunderstandings that are floating around at times when it comes to understanding what a temperature goal means, how to measure it, and how to assess progress towards it. And this should be the topic of my little presentation today. First and foremost, it's important to acknowledge that temperature limits are forward-looking policy targets. So we want to reduce and avoid the future impacts of climate change. That's the purpose of the temperature goal in the Paris Agreement that I added in my slide here and provided a clear linkage to the impact assessment, the forward-looking impact assessment that this temperature goal is meant to achieve. At the same time, being a political target, they should also be appropriate for the scope of the problem, which is climate change since the beginning of human-made emissions, since pre-industrial levels. However, scientifically, the whole story is a little bit more complicated because there are considerable uncertainties in relation to pre-industrial warming levels related to data gaps, but also changes in methodologies and measurements. So therefore, scientific assessments tend to take more recent reference periods and then rather assess warming over the historical period and the future period. The scientific assessment that's of key relevance for the Paris Agreement and has underlined its science policy processes that have led to the adoption of the temperature goal is the 5th assessment report of the IPCC that was adopted in 2014 and used the reference period of 1986 to 2005. All relevant impact assessments that have informed the Paris Agreement have been done relative to this reference period. To arrive from there to pre-industrial levels was done by adding a mere 0.6 degrees offset, so to say, of historical warming since the 1850 to 1900 period based on the Headcode 4 dataset. The iconic burning embers that you see there illustrates this quite well with a temperature bar on the left side that is based on the reference period of the IPCC and the temperature bar on the right side that is actually illustrating warming relative to pre-industrial levels. So if we now want to assess and track progress towards the Paris Agreement, our reference level should be the late 20th century, and then adding historical warming as in the IPCC AR5. Today, in that metric, we are around 0.6 degrees warmer than the late 20th century. So a remarkable finding or acknowledgement here is that the 21st century has seen as much warming and climate change as the 19th and 20th century combined. And if you want to translate this into the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, we'll see that in that metric, a 1.5 degrees compared to the industrial levels basically translates into 0.9 degrees warming above the AR5 reference period, above the late 20th century. And this is how we should approach assessments towards progress towards the temperature goal. And there is another aspect that is important to highlight in that regard, which is that the temperature goal, as the purpose of the UNFCCC, from which I copied this definition from the UNFCCC Convention in 1992, deals with climate change, excluding natural variability, which looks more like a line like this illustrative pathway, the human-made warming as an outcome of our emissions. Real-world realizations of annual global mean temperature look different. They look more like this. On subdecadal timescales, natural variability, year-to-year changes dominate over the long-term trend. However, this doesn't mean that the 1.5 degree limit would be reached any earlier than what the human-made warming implies. So while there might be some individual years that might be warmer than the 1.5 degree or any other limit, it doesn't mean that limit is reached. And in fact, at the point in time when the limit is reached, we would expect half of the years to be warmer than that level. To summarize, I want to leave you with some takeaway messages. So first and foremost, if you want to assess progress towards the long-term temperature goal, we should do this in a forward-looking manner based on the methodology of the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. If there were changes to historic warming or assessments of warming over the 20th century and related uncertainties, this should not affect our forward-looking assessment and the impacts we want to avoid under the 1.5 degree or general temperature limit of the Paris Agreement. And if we exceed that level or even 2 degrees for a single year or month or location, it doesn't mean that our long-term temperature goal has been reached. In fact, our assessment is that it will be unlikely to reach that level in the next decade. And depending on the emission scenario, we might rather reach or exceed the 1.5 degree level between 2030 and 2050, as assessed in the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our discussions today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Piers Forster, and I'll be talking to you today on behalf of myself and Christine McKenna. We're both from the University of Leeds, and we'll be talking about the COVID-19 restrictions and their effect on the long-term temperature goal. I thought I would begin with 2 illustrations of the impacts we are trying to prevent. We have experienced this year the most active hurricane season to date, and if you look at the wildfires in California, these impacts will only get worse until we manage to stabilize temperatures, and we will only do this until we get to net zero emissions. So this was some work I did with my 18-year-old daughter, Harriet, when she was home from school during lockdown. She asked me what would be the climate impact of our behavior change, so we decided to investigate. We had this data from the position of Android telephones provided by Google, and we used the data to analyze the emission changes in 125 countries. So to skip forward to the results, we found big emission reductions in April and then a gradual recovery. We looked at 10 different pollutants, and a lot of the pollutants, like carbon dioxide, we estimate declined by over 10%. There's some uncertainty there, but we think the numbers are in the right sort of ballpark. So what was the resulting effect on surface temperature? In fact, the picture was quite complex. The first thing we found was that you get an increase in surface temperature from a reduction in sulfur dioxide pollution from coal, and this is shown by the green line on the diagram. But this is counteracted by cooling effects from reduced aviation contrails, shown by the red line on the diagram, and also less road pollution, shown by the mauve line on the diagram. And both of these actually give you a cooling. These are all short-term effects. So after a few years, they disappear. And then the only effect we're left with is really a small cooling from carbon dioxide. But when we estimate this cooling is less than 1/100th of a degree overall. And this is because carbon dioxide is such a long-lived greenhouse gas. So you have to get emissions all the way to zero before you have an appreciable effect on surface temperature change. These small temperature changes disappointed my daughter, so she asked me what would we have to do to have an appreciable effect on surface temperature. And there are signs that something more significant was actually occurring. And this next graph shows that. So this shows the change in energy production during April, and it shows that there's been a shift from fossil fuel to renewable energy. So countries were preferentially making green choices. So we decided to extend this and then look at the economic stimulus you would have to do to make these changes more permanent. And in collaboration with Climate Analytics, we found that an investment of just over 1% of GDP and some divestment from fossil fuel would in fact get us onto a Paris target. And these were the emission changes we came up with in our scenarios. So a strong green investment would get us to net zero CO2 by 2050. And it is interesting that the level of green investment for the whole world is not, in fact, that much more than one country, like the UK, is spending on its response to COVID-19. So we put these emission scenarios into our simple model to estimate the effect on surface temperature. And these are shown in the right-hand graph, where we can see that although we don't have a big effect on temperature over the next 10 years, we can have an appreciable effect by 2050. And in these scenarios, we can potentially keep those temperatures below 1.5 degrees. So my colleague, Christine McKenna, has taken this work one stage further, and she has done a more detailed analysis of temperature trends over the next 20 years using both our simple model and then the CMIP6 models. Currently, we are experiencing a temperature trend of over 0.25 degrees per decade, but Christine's work does show that we have the potential to reduce this temperature change, or if we don't make these choices today, we could see unprecedented levels of warming. This is why action today is so important, and I find this work quite exciting that we can potentially make a material difference to temperatures over the next 20 years if we act today. So thank you for your time.
So I'm quite excited to introduce them to you. In no particular order, but first we have Kaisa Kosonen. She's a climate expert and senior political advisor at Greenpeace, based in Finland. She's engaged in a wide range of climate-related issues across the NGO, from renewable energy to national and international climate policy and climate activism. And she's also the IPCC focal point for Greenpeace International. Welcome, welcome, Kaisa. Our second panelist is Maria Laura Rojas. She's the executive director of Transforma, which is an organization advocating for sustainable development, as well as creating knowledge and finding innovative solutions. Her background is in law, and she has several years of experience in climate change and sustainable development, including within the Colombian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She also has worked on other issues like discrimination, human rights, and gender equity, which are, of course, closely related to climate action and climate justice. Our third panelist is Miles Perry, who is an economist, policymaker, and a researcher in energy and climate change within DG Clima of the European Commission. That's the Directorate General for Climate. He has significant experience of both UK and European research and policy institutions, alongside a track record of using environmental, energy, and regulatory economics to develop analytical tools and inform policy. So he's really the panelist that has the strongest foot in what we are doing here today, but also is very closely linked to the actual processes that we are trying to influence and reach. And finally, we have Ruana Haynes, who is a senior legal advisor and team lead for supporting the Alliance of Small Island States at Climate Analytics. She's an experienced international climate law and government specialist with a strong background in climate and other multilateral environmental negotiations. He also has significant experience in international negotiation processes of key importance to small island development states. So it goes without saying that I'm delighted that you're able to join us today. Welcome once again. And without further ado, let me turn immediately to you and hear your reflections on what was presented here. In particular, we would be interested in hearing about how you see our work contributing to the different policy landscapes in which you operate, what opportunities and challenges you see for the impact of our work across your networks, and any general reactions to the overall messages of the presentations. We're always interested in how we can do how we can do things better. So I suggest just going in order in which you were presented. So if I can now turn to Kaisa Kozon, please, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you, Jori, and thank you, Carl, Kasia, and Piers, and all the CONSTRAIN researchers for your great work. It is great to have such complex issues summarized in such a clear way. And I start from this importance of constraining, which is the name of the whole research project. We as NGOs are users of science, and we advocate for action based on latest science. And we ask policymakers to listen to the science, but sometimes the science is actually difficult to listen to when things get too complicated or they underline uncertainties without enough tools to understand the significance of those uncertainties. So what you're doing here in constraining those uncertainties is and this time related to the new generation of climate models, is very much needed. It helps to interpret the latest science and its implications to action needed. And without this deeper understanding, one might jump into misinformed or even fatalistic interpretations, for example, on stronger future warming. So how I'm using this bit of your research is, for example, when preparing for the IPCC 6th assessment report and any pre-reporting of it, and as an expert reviewer of this report, because it helps me to understand what really is new and how it changes the policy responses needed. And secondly, another important contribution you are making with this report is making sure we all know what we are actually talking about when referring to the, I would say, one of the most important bits of the Paris Agreement, the long-term temperature goal, and that we are all using the same language and same definitions for that goal, and for tracking whether it's still within reach. And this, all in all, remains one of the big questions, of course, this year and next year, as countries update their climate plans and targets and prepare for the COP26 next year. Is the Paris Agreement 1.5 goal still within reach, and how do we keep within that reach? And on the other hand, what is the possible future warming we should also prepare for in case we still don't get enough climate action in place in time? And the take-home message I'm taking from this bit of your work is that one shouldn't reinterpret the long-term goal or to interpret it in a too pessimistic or fatalistic way, calling the goal or the Paris Agreement on a whole a failure if temperatures briefly rise above 1.5. Instead, let's stick to the original definition and intention of the goal. That said, in all honesty, even though research keeps reminding, including your research, policymakers that the goal 1.5 goal is still within reach, policymakers, including mine in the European Union, who are just about to decide on their 2030 goal, are still failing to listen to it, unfortunately, and to believe in it. Instead, they are giving up on it, I would say, when you look at the numbers they are about to agree on and the definitions of net reductions that could result in actual reductions being just merely 50.5% emission reductions by 2030 if things go really bad. So all in all, even though we are witnessing unprecedented and encouraging numbers of countries announcing net zero targets, which is also deemed important and necessary by your research, it is still not enough. As climate analytics just assessed, these pledges in their most optimistic reading could limit warming to 1.5 degrees. That is still far from 1.5. So we will be needing faster action, especially in the very near future, as it is the decisions made in the very near future that will lock in a lot of emissions for 2030 and beyond. So there, of course, the third piece of your research this time and the Zero In report is of huge importance and interest, and very timely that the choices made in the COVID-19 recovery spending and action could keep the 1.5 goal alive, and that integrating hard and fast climate action in these recovery packages could over the next 20 years slow down the global warming rates to almost half what we've experienced since 2000. And this is hugely fascinating to get these short-term results and understanding of the action. to me, the next 20 years is already short term, and is something one can comprehend and then look forward to in terms of the results. So that you are coming out with this report, and of course these results have been out there already earlier, but having then repeated now ahead of the Climate Ambition Summit that takes place, the 5-year anniversary next week is very important, and we will benefit. I mean, we will certainly use them in reminding countries that this is the place to signal the centrality of climate resilient recovery at the highest political level. So thank you very much on my behalf. I find this research very helpful and very, very timely.
Thank you, Kaisa. I mean, it's definitely encouraging to hear that many of the messages and the kind of information we provide are really useful, and we also take it. We take also clear note that, of course, the kind of information that is needed doesn't stop just at the physical end, but also more information on what the appropriate emission reductions are and so on is absolutely needed. Unfortunately, that it's not part of our research consortium. But thanks again. And with that, I would like to go to Maria Laura. So I will keep all the questions until the end so that we can have enough time for the interventions of all the panelists. Maria Laura, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and hi everyone. Thank you for having me. Congratulations to CONSTRAIN and to the presenters because of this very timely report and the findings. I think that there are 4 key messages that I take away and that I think are really useful in the policy landscape and the work that we do in trying to raise ambition, not just of NDCs, but also of recovery measures and of long-term pathways and like overall what countries are doing in terms of climate action in their own jurisdictions. And these messages that are actually connected between each other, I think, are the following. The first is that we are still on time to meet the long-term temperature goals. I don't know for how much longer we will be able to say that, but we can say it now. And I think it's a very strong message that we need to continue to emphasize and then needs to continue to drive ambition and urgency from countries all over the world. The second one, which I found very nuanced to what we usually hear, is that strong emission cuts will bring short-term benefits. And this is a really important message when you're working in the policy area, because it's hard to get policymakers to make sometimes, not very popular decisions with a long-term view when the short-term benefits are not, anywhere to be seen, or where actually in the short term, you actually see, some sacrifices that need to be made and some hard decisions that need to be implemented. So hearing that there is going to be short-term benefits is really, really important, not just in terms of cutting emissions, but of course what that brings in terms of adaptation, resilience, and social and economic aspects of this environmental effort. The third one is, and it's one of the most timely now, is that integrating climate action to recovery measures can significantly slow warming. And I think that this was also a very important point. We've been trying to make the case for that everywhere, including, for example, in Colombia and other countries in Latin America, to work not just for green recovery, but for a socially just and resilient recovery in developing countries such as Colombia and others in the region and elsewhere. And it's not just about what we do in terms of investing, but also what we don't do. And that point, I think that those points made in parallel are very, very powerful because it puts them in perspective. And sometimes we think that there's a lot being done for climate action, and there is. But when you look at the numbers of what continues to be invested in fossil fuels industries, as you say it in the report, it's dwarfed by that number. And we really need to continue to look at that very clearly when we're talking about this. And the last one is that I found it really, really timely because we actually did that with the Colombian NDC that we've been advocating for its ambition for the last 3 or 4 weeks, which is to use net zero targets as opposed to carbon budgets when trying to get to the policy aspect of this and the decision making. And it's actually how we ended up doing it, at least for the advocacy part of what we were asking for in the ambition for the government. We actually use the commitment that Colombia has to 2050 to be net zero. And based on that and you know, I'm not an expert, of course, but based on that, the number that came up was, what do we need to do by 2030 so that we can reach net zero by 2050? So when I also saw that in the report, it was like, yeah, that makes sense. That's how we did it. And it's useful to also give hints when CONSTRAIN does that. I think it helps guide conversations to give hints on what's more easy to use for decision making. And indeed, the net zero targets are easier to use than carbon budgets. I'll leave it at that. Thank you and congratulations again.
Thank you for these insights, Maria Laura. Yeah, and these 4 points, yeah, incredibly encouraging to again hear how the kind of information we provide is useful in very different ways. With that, let me go to our next panelist, Miles Perry from the European Commission. Miles Perry, the floor is yours.
Okay, hello, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay, I'll take
yes.
that as a yes. Okay, right. And thanks for the answer to the question about short-term measures. I think that I think I covered it. I was interested to know whether the scenario would be particularly tilted to get a short-term temperature hit. But yeah, okay, you cleared that up. All right. Well, I think I'd start with well, with my answers to the questions which the organisers suggested we think about, and I think these presentations have been very useful, and I mean it's really great to see how I think, to reflect what Kasia said, how the science has become, you know, much more synthesized and understandable over the past few years, past few IPCC iterations, and how we see that feeding into how the policy process is working at international level. So I mean, it's a cliche that you know, at the UNFCCC, countries can negotiate with each other, but you can't actually negotiate with the climate. And so, you know, that's why having, you know, science as a guide to the international agreements is so important. And I think we've seen, I think I mean, I think back to AR4 and then through AR5 in Paris in this 1.5 report, and it's great to see how it's become clearer over time. And it was good that Carl pointed out some of the history of how you interpret these temperature thresholds and temperature goals. So I mean, it was great to see the the science on carbon budgets and then decarbonization pathways, how that was communicated so clearly in the 1.5 degree special report, because I think that was much clearer than past IPCC reports. And I imagine the science itself hasn't gotten any simpler, so it must be due to some, you know, good collaborative work going on there. And yeah, just this week I had to answer another letter from a group of concerned citizens who still suspected that that climate change was perhaps not a human-induced phenomenon. And again, I just had to go straight to the latest IPCC report, and it was so black and white, the evidence. It was, you know, just very simple to debunk. And I think and these improvements, Carl has already pointed out how they're reflected in the Paris Agreement. So both the principle of being guided by best available science and the goal itself with the balance between emissions and removals this century. And I think this has been useful because, as Maria said, we now have you know, this domino effect of net zero as being, you know, the national milestone that everyone wants to hit. And okay, we can definitely have many arguments about the fact that it's easier to agree to net zero in the long term than it is to actually get started with the short-term decarbonization to get you there. But nevertheless, I think this is a tremendous innovation in, you know, narrowing the parameters of the debate about where we need to get to. I think especially at national level, because it's so much easier than thinking about a budget. Oh, hold on, what happens if we exhaust the budget or the science changed in the meantime? And it's so much easier than thinking about a specific national effort sharing approaches. So so that's been really helpful, just in terms of centering the argument in a way which is consistent with the science. So it's really great to see that it's all coming together. You know, you have in the EU, this is the approach we're following too. So I'm not able to say here and now that to announce a target increase for 2030, but the political discussion about that is underway, and it's specifically, the argumentation of the Commission's proposal on it is specifically that we've managed to agree to net zero to climate neutrality in 2050, and now we see that our existing 2030 target would make the drop too steep if we didn't cut emissions by more by 2030. So yeah, let's watch this space for that, but hopefully a science-guided target setting in action. Okay, but that's the good news. But obviously the challenge is that we know that globally the 2030 commitments aren't enough. We know that 1.5 or 2 degrees. Yeah, thank you, Kasia. That they're still in reach, but it gets harder and harder as time goes by. I mean, I think everyone on this conference knows that, and that means that the job of navigating policy by science is going to get tougher and tougher because it becomes more near term, which was partly why I asked about the questions about the short term temperature hit. So I think in terms of recommendations going forward, I think that I think it's great that the science message, especially as synthesized by the IPCC, is concrete, and it's so something concrete like net zero is something that policymakers can understand, and that it's solid and a consensus, because that's how we might translate it into policy, and so I'm trying to think about what the next thing, which is as simple as net zero, could be, and the answer is it's probably not going to be as simple, but it would be questions like how can we mitigate, so try and stop the temperature rise in the short term and in the long term at the same time, taking into account all of the socioeconomic and technical effects, and then also similarly for adaptation, how can we adapt and mitigate at the same time. And I think as the questions become more applied, especially in adaptation, it becomes harder to separate science, pure science, from policy. So that's also something that's tricky. But I I encourage the CONSTRAIN and both as a research consortium and as people involved in AR6 to just to keep working on this, and especially Christina, I hope your short-term temperature work gets a good IPCC review treatment. So we know, what to make of it in a fully IPCC approved way. Yeah, and then in terms of the EU policy process, I'll just say a bit about that. So as I said already, we're looking at updating the 2030 targets. That's under political discussion at the moment. And what's also under political discussion is the EU climate law. So politically, the heads of government have already agreed to net zero by 2050. But I think what's useful about the climate law is it has this kind of, well, we don't know what form it's going to take because it's also under political discussion, but it will have some form of milestones and monitoring, and it will also have adaptation as the goal, not just emissions reduction. And so I think this kind of framework must be how we get more granular on continuing to navigate by science while the questions that we have to answer get more challenging and the effects get more short term. And,
thank you, Matt. Sorry to interrupt you there. I need to interrupt you in the interest of time to have enough time for our last panelist. But I thank you very much for your insight. And I think something that I really take away from your intervention is, and from others, is kind of the interest in net zero, but also kind of it has been there, but maybe this might be a good topic to further explore within the consortium of what kind of the limitations or the strengths are also from having net zero targets, both for the climate and for policy. So thanks again. And sorry to have had to interrupt you, but I want to have enough time to give to Rana Haynes, our last panelist. Ruana, if you are ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yuri, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you very much to CONSTRAIN organizers for inviting me to speak on this panel. A lot of what I would have said has already been said by my co-panelists, so I'm happy to go last. I have very few, I think, additional comments to make. First of all, I really enjoyed all of the presentations that were made. I always find that this work where we try to really match the science with the policy and enhance the policy science interface to be really, really useful and always a great opportunity to learn and further understand. In terms of just some observations, I think it's very, very valuable for us to acknowledge that there's still work to be done to understand the Paris Agreement long-term temperature goal. This is one of the key messages that I took from Carl's presentation, for example, and I also really appreciated the context that was set by Kasia in looking at just really understanding how do we process the information that we receive from the climate model. So I think the message I would take from those two presentations is that as the science evolves, we have to keep up, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the policy space to make sure that we are understanding the science in a way that's valuable and beneficial to us, and in a way that contributes to our work. So for example, right now in the UNFCCC process, we have just started the structured expert dialogue on the review of the long-term temperature goal. And I would imagine that a lot of what has been presented by Carl, by Kasia, would be very useful inputs into that discussion, as well as AR6 inputs once they become available. And I think that it is important for us to be able to keep our sights on that process, even as we're busy negotiating with each other, as Miles put it. I think my second point would be on this notion of time as it relates to the green recovery and how we understand the green recovery and what it could really mean. From where I sit, it's not clear to me that governments are approaching policy planning and recovery planning, stimulus package planning from a perspective of looking at what the longer term impacts could be of what they're doing, or understanding really that what they do right now should also be matched with their efforts on climate change as well in the shorter term. So I think those are two points there, and I'll just explain those a little. On the first point, in terms of the time frame, my understanding is that for many governments, their first response in stimulus spending, which what I understand as an emergency response, is also somehow understood as the first and last opportunity for a green recovery. And so for many of them, they see that an opportunity to actually green their recovery efforts has already gone by, which from what I've seen from Piers's presentation, for example, is not necessarily the case. We expect that recovery efforts and stimulus spending will continue, and there is still an opportunity for governments to get this right. And I don't know that that message is getting to policymakers. And then the point that is related to that has to do with, again, this issue that we are constantly dealing with, matching or coordinating actions across governments. And so, for example, when looking at stimulus spending and the decisions around stimulus spending, it's clear that a lot of it is being guided by economic and finance ministries that are a lot less involved, for example, in the NDC planning process, in the Paris Agreement process, and who may not in many instances be overly concerned with the idea of a green recovery. And because that's happening, there is this disconnect coming from many governments, even developed countries, where you have the environment ministries or the ministries that are dealing with climate change, announcing or establishing hopes for quite ambitious 2030 NDCs, but then at the same time going in the opposite direction with their stimulus spending, as though those two issues have absolutely nothing to do with each other when they have absolutely everything to do with each other. And so I guess for me, a major opportunity coming out of the type of work that CONSTRAIN is doing here would be to try to encourage governments to connect those dots. Because if they don't, well, we've seen from Piers's draft chart, the worst case scenario of what can happen coming out of this recovery phase and actually setting us back, or at least completely nullifying what countries are trying to do on the 2030 horizon, which of course is going to make the drop steeper, I think is how Miles put it, for getting to that 2050 net zero target. And so all of these things are connected. And I guess my hope in this context is that we can have more conversations like this, where we try to penetrate sometimes the almost impenetrable fortresses that policymakers put up to get these messages across and ensure that they're well understood. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rowena. And thank you again to all the panelists. We have now spent the hour here for our webinar, so we will be concluding soon. But if I can quickly sum up, I really think that Rowana's coming last also made some really nice suggestions that I think we as a consortium and a research consortium would be happy to take forward, is to encourage more of these kind of conversations, which at least I think are extremely useful, not in the least for us to know how we can and what kind of information we can provide to really support the decisions that are and the discussions that are taking place in the negotiations. And then, of course, as a scientist, I'm always happy to hear that we need to try encourage people to connect the dots. And I think that is also something that we as a consortium try to work towards. So with that, I would again like to thank the three presenters and all the panelists, and of course also once again thank you for all the participants and that came. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for staying over 3 minutes, also over the hour. But hope to see you soon again in another event. And keep in mind, the Zero In report will be published in the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye out for that, for a more elaborate description and more figures on the presentations that you have seen today. Thank you. Thank you all, and well, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, and to all of you. Thank you.